The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the maples along Route 9 had gone the color of old rust, and the fields between Hardin County's small farms lay stripped and gray after harvest. Gunnery Sergeant Decker Hale had been awake since 4, sitting at the kitchen table of the motel room he'd rented by the week, drinking coffee that had gone cold while he read the same paragraph of a water rights form 3 times without it entering his mind. Outside, a combine moved slowly along the ridgeline a mile east, its lights blinking in the dark like something cautious and deliberate. His German shepherd, a 7-year-old male named Cobb, lay across the threshold of the bathroom door with his chin on the tile, and his amber eyes tracking the window. Cobb moved before Decker heard anything. He lifted his head, rolled onto his haunches, and fixed his gaze on the motel room door with the quality of stillness that meant something outside had changed. A moment later, footsteps on gravel, then a knock. The county attorney's clerk, a young woman in a barn jacket with her hair pulled back, handed Decker a certified envelope and asked him to sign a form on a clipboard. He signed. She said good morning and walked back to her car without explaining anything else. Decker set the envelope on the table and looked at it. Cobb came and sat beside him and pressed the side of his head gently against Decker's knee. The return address read, Estate of Harold Ray Cadell, Hardin County Probate Court. Decker did not know a Harold Ray Cadell. He had never known a Harold Ray Cadell. He had driven through Hardin County exactly once in his life, 14 years ago, on a road trip he barely remembered. He opened the envelope and began to read, and somewhere in the second page, where the legal language stopped and a handwritten addendum began in the trembling cursive of an old man near the end of his strength, his jaw tightened, and he looked away from the paper and stared at the far wall of the motel room for a long time. If this story stays with you, subscribe and turn on the bell and watch until the very end. The old man's handwriting said things that did not make sense until they did. It said, I watched you once, from the road. You were 17. You stopped your truck on the county route and carried a box turtle out of the traffic lane and set it in the grass on the far side of the fence. You did not look around to see if anyone was watching. You just did it. I was 80 feet away in my field and you never saw me. I wrote your truck's plates in my pocket notebook. I thought, that young man will be decent when nobody is watching. I wanted to leave my land to someone like that. The letter was dated 9 months ago. Harold Ray Cadell had died in August, 6 weeks before the corn came in. He had been 81 years old. He had lived alone on 312 acres of mixed cropland and pasture in the northeastern corner of Hardin County since his wife, Vera, had died 4 years prior. He had no children. A nephew in Phoenix had not called in 11 years. A niece in Atlanta had come for Vera's funeral and not come back. He had a farmhand named Orvis Peck, 63, who had worked the land alongside him for 22 years, and a county extension agent named Karen Sully, who brought soil reports twice a year and pound cake at Christmas. And he had left his 312 acres, his farmhouse, his equipment shed, his old John Deere, and 3 other pieces of working machinery, and every dollar remaining in his estate to Gunnery Sergeant Decker Hale, United States Marine Corps. Decker sat with that for a while. Cobb put his chin on the table and watched him. Decker turned the page and read the formal language about the conditions of the bequest, the taxes owed, the state of the title, the 60-day timeline for claiming the estate before a second disposition took effect. Then he turned to the last handwritten page and read the rest of what Harold had written. And that was when something behind his eyes shifted in a way he had not expected and could not immediately manage. He put the papers down on the table and pressed his palms flat against the wood and looked at his hands until the feeling passed. He was 41 years old. He stood 6'2" and weighed 210 pounds, most of it accumulated over 2 decades of deployments, disaster relief rotations, and the kind of physical discipline that becomes involuntary after long enough. His face was broad and weathered, with a jaw that came to prominence when he was concentrating on something difficult, and crow's feet at the corners of dark brown eyes that did not soften even when the rest of his expression did. He had a scar along his left forearm from a fence wire that had nothing to do with combat, and a longer one across his right shoulder from something that did. His hair was military short, salt and pepper at the temples now, darker at the crown. He had been discharged 8 months ago, honorably, after 22 years of service, and he had spent those 8 months doing something he could not have described precisely to anyone who asked. Moving, mostly. Taking short-term work that kept him occupied without requiring him to explain himself. Staying in places for a few weeks at a time and then feeling the familiar pull of the next road and following it without much resistance. He knew what that was. He did not particularly want to name it. He folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Cobb looked at him with the patient expectancy of a dog who had learned that his person made decisions slowly. Decker poured the cold coffee down the drain and made a fresh pot. While it was brewing, he stood at the window and looked out at the combining operation along the ridgeline. 312 acres. He had never owned land. His father had talked about it the way men who never had it talked about it, with a kind of reverence that always carried grief underneath. He drank his coffee and told himself he would drive out and look at the property and nothing more. He was not committing to anything. That habit did not break easily. Cobb went to the door. Decker pulled on his jacket and put the envelope inside it, and they went out into the cold October morning. The Cadell farm lay 11 miles northeast of the county seat, up a 2-lane road that climbed through hardwood stands and open pasture before flattening out onto the agricultural shelf where most of the serious farming in Hardin County happened. Decker drove it slowly, Cobb with his nose near the cracked window. The land on either side was good land, squared off and tended, the fence lines maintained, the farms spaced as farms used to be spaced, far enough apart that you could not see your neighbor's light on a dark night. The property announced itself with a hand-routed cedar sign at the gate. Cadell, established 1948. Decker opened the gate and drove through and closed it. The lane to the farmhouse was 3/10 of a mile of packed gravel, lined with Osage orange trees that had grown large enough to lace their canopies overhead. The farmhouse took shape at the end of it. 2 stories, white frame, wide porch across the full front, a red metal roof and a stone chimney at the north end. The house had the settled look of a structure that had made its peace with the land beneath it. A woodshed leaned against the north wall, half full of split oak. The barn stood 60 yards behind the house, substantial and red, with a steel equipment shed beside it that was newer than everything else on the property. Decker stopped the truck and sat a moment. Cobb was already making small, urgent movements in his seat, nose working, reading the difference between a place recently tended and one recently abandoned. The Cadell farm fell in between. Someone had mowed the yard through the season. The woodshed had been filled after Harold died, which meant someone had been out here working since August. Orvis Peck. The letter had mentioned him. Cobb dropped to the gravel and began a sweeping circuit while Decker walked to the porch steps. 2 wide wooden chairs, worn smooth from decades of use, a porch swing built rather than bought, and a row of hooks beside the front door where a canvas barn jacket still hung, its pockets worn soft. Harold's jacket. Nobody had moved it yet. Decker looked at it for a long moment and could not find much of anything comfortable inside himself. He heard boots on gravel before he heard the truck, which meant whoever was coming had killed the engine at the gate and walked in. Cobb heard it first, of course. He stopped his circuit and turned toward the lane and stood absolutely still, not aggressive, but measuring. Decker turned to see a man walking the last 100 yards of gravel drive toward him. He was 63 or 64, broad through the chest and narrower at the hips than men that age usually were, wearing canvas work pants and a heavy flannel shirt and boots that had spent serious time in field conditions. His face was wide and blunt-featured, with a gray beard trimmed close, and a permanent squint from years of reading weather in open country. His gray hair was pressed flat under a feed store cap. He walked without hurrying, which was itself a kind of statement. This was Orvis Peck, and he looked like a man who had decided on the way over exactly what he was going to say. He stopped 10 feet from the porch steps and looked at Decker with eyes that were calm and not warm. He looked at Cobb. Cobb looked back at him and after a moment lowered his head slightly and sat. Orvis saw that and something in his jaw eased by a fraction. He said, "You're the one from the will." Decker said, "Yes." Orvis looked at the house. He looked at the jacket on the hook and then looked at Decker again. "Harold never mentioned you," he said, and his voice carried no accusation in it, only the plain statement of a fact that had been sitting on him for 2 months. "I didn't know him," Decker said. "I know." Orvis was quiet for a moment. A crow called from somewhere past the barn, and neither man looked toward it. "I'm going to say something plain," Orvis said. "All right. I've worked this land for 22 years. I built the equipment shed. I put the French drain in the north field myself. I know every wet spot and every rise on this property. I don't have a legal claim to any of it, and I know that too. Harold had a right to leave it how he chose. I need to know what you're going to do with it, because there's winter wheat to get into the ground in the next 3 weeks, and if that doesn't happen, you lose that income and you lose the soil structure in the south, 40 besides." Decker said, "You're telling me you're going to keep doing the work if I let you." Orvis looked at him steadily. "I'm telling you the land doesn't stop needing attention because the paperwork changed hands." Cobb got up from where he'd been sitting and walked over to Orvis Peck and stood beside him and looked up at him once and then looked back at Decker. Orvis looked down at the dog with an expression that was the first fully readable thing in his face, something that was not quite surprise and not quite grief, but that lived in the neighborhood of both. He put his hand down, and Cobb pressed his forehead against it briefly. Orvis said more quietly than before, "Harold liked dogs." Decker said, "What was he like?" It was not the question Orvis had expected. He looked up from the dog and studied Decker for a moment. Then he said, "Come inside. I'll put coffee on." The inside of the farmhouse was the inside of a life that had been lived in one place for a very long time. The entryway smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and the particular damp wool smell of a cold house that was heated only intermittently in the weeks after someone had stopped living in it. The kitchen was large and practical, with a gas range that had seen serious use, and a table big enough to seat 8 that had been used primarily by 2 people for 50 years and then by 1 person for 4. The counters were clear. The dishes were washed and stacked. Someone, almost certainly Orvis, had come in and done the small final courtesies that a man's house deserves when he is no longer in it, to do them himself. On the wall beside the kitchen window was a row of framed photographs. Decker stood in front of them while Orvis filled the kettle. The photographs went back decades. A young man and a young woman beside a tractor, new in perhaps 1955, squinting into summer light. The same two people, older, at a county fair, the woman holding a ribbon, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Harold Caudell, as a man in his middle 50s, standing in a field of wheat, one hand shading his eyes, his face baked and creased by outdoor work, but open in a way that some faces lose and some faces keep their whole lives. Harold had kept it. Cobb sat beside Decker and looked at the photographs with him. Orvis set two mugs on the table, and they sat, and Orvis told him about Harold Caudell, plainly and without sentiment. Harold had farmed this land for 53 years, inheriting it from his father at 28 as 160 acres with a failing drainage system, expanding it to 312 by buying adjacent parcels when neighbors sold, paying what was fair and never pressing the advantage when someone was desperate. He had served 2 terms on the County Agricultural Board and declined a third because he said he was better at farming than at meetings. Vera had taught 2nd grade for 31 years and had died of a heart attack on a Wednesday morning in early spring in this kitchen, while Harold was in the south field. The coroner said she had been gone before she reached the floor. Harold had found her at lunch. He had not recovered from that in the way people speak of recovering. He had continued. There is a difference. Orvis said that in the last year of his life, Harold had put the farm's books in impeccable order, repaired everything that needed repairing, filled the woodshed twice over, and spent his evenings writing letters in the longhand that had gone shaky at the end. He did not tell Orvis what was in the letters. He only said once, in November of the previous year, that he had figured out what to do about the land and that it was settled in his mind. Decker listened to all of this. He held his mug with both hands and looked at the tabletop and listened. When Orvis finished, he said, "The handwritten part of the letter. Did you know he'd written it?" "No," Orvis said. "I knew he was writing something. I didn't ask." "He wrote about a turtle," Decker said. Orvis looked at him. Decker told him what the letter said. When he was done, Orvis was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the Osage orange trees along the drive, and the sound came through the kitchen window as a low, continuous pressure. "He kept pocket notebooks his whole life," Orvis said finally, "going back to when he was a young man. Recorded things he saw, weather, which fields needed what, animals he came across. The notebooks are in the office upstairs." Decker said, I wanted to see the land before I decide anything." "All right," Orvis said. "Walk it with me." They spent 2 hours walking the property. Orvis showed him the field conditions, the tile drainage in the low-lying northeast corner, the windbreak of white cedar Harold had planted along the western boundary 20 years ago that was now thick enough to make a genuine difference in the exposed fields behind it. He showed him the equipment shed, the barn tight and dry and smelling of old hay and machine oil, and the creek that cut through the southeastern corner, lined with sycamores that had been there longer than the farm had. Decker walked all of it. Cobb ranged wide and came back, working the edges of the fields and the creek bank with the absorbed energy of a dog in genuinely new country. The land was quiet the way productive land is quiet between seasons, a pause that is not emptiness but rest. Decker felt something in his chest that he did not immediately identify. On the way back toward the house, Orvis said, "There's something you should know about the estate." Decker looked at him. "Harold's nephew, Darren Caudell, out of Phoenix. He filed a contest with the probate court about 3 weeks after the will was read." Decker stopped walking. "On what grounds?" "He's arguing Harold wasn't competent when he wrote the testamentary documents. There are 2 other attorneys involved now. Darren hired a firm out of Columbus." He paused. "Harold was competent. He was sharp until the month before he died. His doctor will say so. Karen Sully will say so. I'll say so. It takes time to get through the legal process, and in the meantime, there's a 60-day window on the probate claim before the secondary disposition triggers, and the county gets involved. You've got 22 days left of that window. 22 days. Decker stood in the field with the cold October light flat and even across the harvested rows and looked back at the farmhouse. The red metal roof, the stone chimney, the woodshed built against the north wall that Harold Codell had filled twice over, as if he had known someone else was going to need it. Cobb came and sat beside him without being called, which was what Cobb did when he felt something in Decker change. Decker said, "You planted the winter wheat yet?" Orvis said, "I was waiting to see what you were going to do." Decker said, "Start Monday." He drove back to the motel that evening and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. He thought about all the places he had been in the last 8 months and could not find a single one of them in his memory that felt like anything other than a corridor between two other places. He had told himself that was freedom. He had been half convinced of it. Cobb lay on the floor beside him with the amber patience of an animal who required only proximity. Decker got out his phone and called the county attorney's office and left a message. He called his bank. For the first time in 8 months, he did not feel the pull of the next road. He was asleep before 9. He moved out of the motel the next morning. 2 bags, Cobb's gear, and the small wooden box he had carried from place to place for years, and he put them in the bedroom at the top of the stairs that looked out over the south field. He did not tell himself anything particular about this. He made coffee and stood on the porch and drank it while Cobb investigated the perimeter of the yard. Orvis arrived at 7:30, took one look at the truck parked beside the house with its overnight gear unloaded, and said nothing about it. He said, "Coffee ready?" Decker said, "Yes." They sat at the kitchen table, and Orvis laid out the plan for the winter wheat, and Decker listened and asked questions that were not a farmer's questions, but were not stupid questions either. Cobb lay under the table, and at some point put his chin on Orvis's boot, and Orvis looked down at him, and then looked back at the planting schedule, and something in his expression had shifted by the time he looked up again. That was how the first week went. Decker worked the land alongside Orvis, without pretending he knew what he was doing beyond what Orvis was showing him. He drove the grain drill in the south field, while Orvis walked ahead scouting. And he came to understand in the first afternoon the quality of attention that work required, the constant reading of ground conditions. He fixed the wheel bearing on the flatbed trailer over 2 evenings in the equipment shed. He split wood. He found the pocket notebooks in the upstairs office, 31 of them in a shallow cardboard box on the shelf above Harold's desk, going back to 1971, and he read them in the evenings after supper. The notebooks were not literature. They were the records of a man paying attention to his land and his life with a regularity that was its own form of devotion: weather observations, soil notes, the dates of first frost and last frost going back half a century, brief notations about animals, a red fox denning in the northeast woodlot for 3 consecutive springs, a great horned owl in the barn loft, occasionally a notation about a person. Karen Sully brought soil tests and a peach cobbler, which was better than last year's. Orvis finished the Northfield drainage repair, did not mention payment, will not hear of it, stubborn as the tile he laid. In the notebook dated 4 years back, the year Vera died, there were no entries for March. The notebook resumed in April with a soil temperature notation and nothing else. That absence said more than anything written could have. Decker sat with that notebook for a long time, the lamp on, Cobb asleep across his feet, the wind working at the eaves. He understood something about Harold Caudell that the letter had only begun to express. A man who had taught himself to continue by keeping his attention on the work in front of him, on the soil and the weather and the small daily demands of a farm that did not stop needing care because grief had arrived. Harold had been continuing somewhere. Decker had been continuing in the general direction of nowhere in particular. He was beginning to understand the difference. Darren Caudell arrived on a Thursday morning in the second week, which Decker had been told to expect but had not been told the precise timing of. He heard a vehicle on the gravel lane and stepped off the porch to see a dark blue sedan, very clean, moving up toward the house with the careful, disapproving slowness of someone who objected to unpaved surfaces. Cobb came from around the corner of the house and positioned himself beside Decker and went very still. Darren Caudell was 51 years old, somewhat shorter than Decker, with the physical softness of a man who had spent his adult life in offices. He wore a dark jacket and shoes entirely wrong for the farm, and looked at the property with the expression of a man calculating rather than observing. His face was managed in the way of someone practiced at managing the information it conveyed. He stepped out and put on a careful, professional smile. Cobb made a sound in the back of his throat that was not quite a growl. It was the sound of a working dog filing a preliminary assessment. Darren's smile held, but his eyes went to Cobb and back to Decker with a small recalibration. "Mr. Hale," he said, extending his hand. "Darren Caudell. I appreciate you making time." Decker shook his hand. "I didn't make time," he said. "You came on a Thursday." Darren's smile adjusted marginally. He looked at the house again. "I was hoping we could speak frankly," he said. "I intend to be frank," Decker said. "Come to the porch." They sat in the two wide wooden chairs, and Cobb positioned himself near the porch steps, between Darren and the door. Darren did not appear comfortable with this. He spoke for several minutes about the family situation, the difficulty of geography, the pressures of a demanding career, the legal questions around the will's validity. He spoke with the practiced reasonableness of someone who had thought carefully about how to present each point. He suggested that a fair resolution might involve Decker relinquishing the estate claim in exchange for a payment his attorneys had characterized as generous. He used the word generous twice in 2 minutes. Cobb did not move. He sat and watched Darren with the total, unhurried attention of a dog who has made up his mind and is simply waiting for the human beside him to confirm it. Decker said, "Harold left you nothing on purpose." Darren stopped speaking. "Not as an oversight," Decker said. "He made a deliberate choice. Whatever reasons he had for that choice, he understood his own affairs well enough to arrange them correctly, and his doctor and his neighbors and the man who has worked this land for 22 years will confirm that." Darren said, "The courts will determine competency." "Yes," Decker said. "They will." He paused. "You didn't come here for 11 years. He said it without heat, as a plain fact, the way Orvis had stated plain facts to him on the first morning. "I was busy," Darren said. His managed face had developed a slight fault along the jawline. "He was your uncle," Decker said. "He lived alone here for 4 years after his wife died. He worked his land, and he kept his books, and he filled his woodshed twice over because he had enough foresight and enough pride to leave things right. He was not confused. He was not incapacitated. He was lonely." He stopped there. Darren was quiet. Whatever smooth rebuttal he had prepared did not come. Cobb turned his head slightly and looked at Decker just for a moment, and then looked back at Darren. Darren said, "What do you intend to do with the property?" "Farm it," Decker said. There was a silence. A cold wind moved across the porch, and Decker felt it, and Darren pulled his jacket closed, and Cobb's fur barely moved. Darren said, "You're not a farmer." "Not yet," Decker said. Darren left 20 minutes later without any agreement, and without the smooth finish his visit had started with. Decker watched the sedan disappear through the gate and sat a while longer in the chair Harold Cordell had worn, smooth over decades. He thought about what it cost to simply not show up. Cobb came and sat with his flank against Decker's boot, and they stayed like that until Orvis's truck turned in at the gate, and then Decker went inside to start lunch. Karen Sully, the county extension agent, came on a Friday afternoon near the end of the second week. She was 61 years old, trim and practical, with silver hair cut short and reading glasses that lived on top of her head until she needed them. She carried a file of soil analysis records that went back 15 years and walked Decker through the history of the land's fertility with the efficient warmth of a person who loves her work. She had known Harold for 16 years. She said, "He was one of the better stewards I've worked with in this county. He didn't take from the soil more than he was willing to put back." She looked at Decker with an appraising directness that reminded him of senior NCOs he had respected. She said, "He told me last spring he was going to do something unusual with the property. He didn't say what." Decker said, "Did it surprise you when you heard?" She considered this. "The choice surprised me. The reasoning didn't." She paused. Harold believed character was visible in small private acts, more reliably than in large public ones. He spent his whole life looking for evidence of it. She looked out the kitchen window at the south field, where the winter wheat was just beginning its first faint greening, a color almost too pale to name against the dark soil. "He found it in you," she said. "In a 17-year-old with a turtle," Decker said, and his voice was not quite even. "He thought that was enough to bet on." She put her glasses on, and they spent an hour on the soil records. When she left, she said, "I'll file an affidavit about Harold's competency with the probate court. So will Dr. McCready. Darren's attorneys are not going to find the record they're looking for." She shook his hand and looked at Cobb, who had placed his head in her lap at least twice without being invited. She scratched behind his ears and said, "Harold would have liked this dog." After she left, Decker stood in the kitchen for a long time. The afternoon light fell across the table, and the photographs and the empty mug Karen Sully had left. He thought about Harold Cordell carrying that observation in a pocket notebook for 24 years, through the death of his wife and the isolation of his last years, holding it as evidence of something worth leaving something to. The pressure in his chest was not something he tried to manage. He let it be there. Cobb pressed against his leg, and he put his hand on the dog's back until the light changed. The probate challenge took 4 more weeks to resolve, and in those 4 weeks, 3 things happened that Decker had not planned for. The first was that Orvis Peck arrived one Friday with a duffel bag and asked without ceremony if the back bedroom off the kitchen was available. He said he was not asking for anything he had not earned, and that if Decker wanted rent, he would pay it. Decker said the room was available, and rent was not required. Orvis put his bag in the bedroom and hung his barn jacket on the hook beside the door without further comment. The second thing was that Karen Sully came back on a Tuesday with 2 women from the County Agricultural Cooperative. Bet Harrington, who ran the largest farm supply operation in Hardin County, and Doris Crane, a retired school teacher whose family had farmed the next property east for 3 generations. They brought a casserole and a pie and seed catalogs and sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, And when they left, Karen Sully said to Decker quietly, "Harold had friends in this county. They're going to be your friends too if you let them." The third thing was that Decker found in the back of the bottom drawer of Harold's office desk, beneath a folder of farm insurance documents and a stapled copy of Harold's marriage certificate, a photograph he had not seen among the others on the kitchen wall. It was a small print, the kind made from a phone camera image, showing Harold Caudell at what appeared to be about 78 years old, sitting on the porch steps of this house in the summer, with his elbows on his knees and his face turned toward the south field. He was watching something in the field. His expression was not sad exactly. It was patient in a way that contained within it the memory of every season that had passed and the readiness for whatever season came next. On the back of the photograph, in Harold's hand, were 4 words: "This is enough. Stay." Decker sat with that photograph at the desk for a long time. Cobb came upstairs and found him there, and lay down across the threshold of the office door and sighed once, the long exhalation of a dog settling in for the duration. The probate court ruled against Darren Caudell's competency challenge on a Tuesday morning in late November. The affidavits from Dr. Gerald McCready, Karen Sully, and Orvis Peck, combined with the county attorney's review of Harold's financial and legal records, gave the court a picture of a man of exceptional clarity. Darren's attorneys had found no medical irregularity, no confusion, no witness who would say otherwise. They had found the opposite. Decker received the ruling by phone while he was in the equipment shed, replacing a hydraulic line on the field cultivator. He stood a moment with his phone in his hand and grease on the other and looked at the view of the south field through the open door, the winter wheat visibly green across the rows, thin and steady. He called Orvis in from the barn and told him. Orvis said, "Good." He went back to the barn. Decker put his phone away and went back to the hydraulic line. That evening, without anyone having organized it or sent word, the kitchen filled. Bet Harrington came with her husband, a quiet man who went directly to the equipment shed and spent an hour examining the John Deere, with the focused approval of a man who respects good machines. Doris Crane came with a covered pot that smelled of onions and herbs. 2 men from the county extension meeting came and brought firewood and stacked it in the woodshed without being asked. Karen Sully came last, after dark, and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at people moving through Harold's kitchen with the competent ease of people who knew how to be present in a space that needed filling. She looked at Decker standing at the far side of the table with Cobb beside him, and smiled the way people smile when something they hoped for has arrived. Cobb moved through the kitchen that evening with the settled ease he reserved for rooms he had categorized as safe. He greeted each person once and then returned to Decker's side. He had decided about this place in the first days. He had decided before Decker had. Nobody said anything particularly formal. They ate at the big kitchen table and talked about the county and the coming winter, and the drainage challenges of the northeast corner of the Caudell property that Orvis explained with the authority of a man who had built those drainage structures himself. At some point, Bet Harrington's husband came in from the equipment shed and said the John Deere was in better condition than machines half its age. The compliment carried in it a form of respect for Harold that was also a form of welcome to Decker. When they left, close to 9, each person said goodbye in the plain, unlabored way of people who expected to be back. Doris Crane stopped in the doorway and said, "Harold always said this land had a way of finding the right person eventually. I think he engineered it a little." Decker said, "Yes, ma'am, I think he did." She nodded and went out into the cold November night. Orvis washed the dishes without being asked, as he had taken to doing, and Decker dried them as he had taken to doing, and neither of them said much. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, light and dry, salting the dark ground and the green rows of winter wheat and the red roof of the barn with a thin, white precision. Cobb stood at the kitchen window and watched it with the alert, absorbed attention he gave to things that were new and worth understanding. Decker stood beside him and watched it too. The weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas on the Caudell farm settled something in Decker that had been unsettled longer than his discharge. It did not happen in a single moment. It happened the way the winter wheat grew, below the surface, visible only in retrospect. He learned the land through use, by making mistakes and being corrected by the land itself, following Orvis's explanations back to principles that then applied elsewhere, cross-referencing Karen Sully's soil records against Harold's notebooks, until the relationship between them became instinct rather than calculation. He drove to the probate court in early December and completed the formal transfer. When the paralegal handed him the recorded deed, he stood in the courthouse hallway and put it in his inside jacket pocket, next to Harold's handwritten letter. He felt both documents there together and walked out to the truck where Cobb was waiting. He had kept moving because keeping moving felt like discipline. He had known for some time that it was not. He pulled up the gravel lane under the Osage orange trees and saw the light in the kitchen window where Orvis was making supper. And he sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. On a Saturday morning in early December, Decker went upstairs to Harold's office and sat at the desk he had begun using for the farm's records. He took out the pocket notebook he had bought in town and carried for 2 weeks without opening. He wrote the date and the weather and the condition of the south field, and a note about the hydraulic coupling on the grain drill that would need attention before spring. He wrote, "Orvis says the northeast woodlot has a fox denning again. Same corner, Harold noted, for 3 consecutive springs. We'll watch for it." He understood that he was not picking up a habit. He was continuing something that had not ended, only paused, waiting for someone to continue it. He wrote one more line. "This is where I am." Then he put the pen down and looked out the window at the south field and the winter wheat and the white sky above the Osage orange trees, bare now and precisely drawn against the winter light. Cobb lay across the threshold of the office door with his chin on the floor and his eyes half closed, present the way only dogs are completely present, without ambivalence or reservation. There is something in a story like this one that asks us to think about what we owe the people who watch us when we do not know we are being watched. Harold Caudell spent a lifetime looking for evidence of character in the small, unremarkable moments when a person does right because it is right, with no witness and no reward. He found it once on a county road, wrote it in a notebook, and spent 24 years holding that observation as a kind of faith. And a man who had spent 2 decades moving through the world at the speed of necessity, who had confused motion with purpose and distance with freedom, found himself called home by a dead man's handwriting to a piece of ground he had never stood on, to a life that had been prepared and waiting and left deliberately for him to continue. None of us know when we are being seen at our truest. None of us know which unremarkable moment someone else is quietly cataloging as evidence of who we really are. The old man with the pocket notebook understood something about that. He understood that character is not declared. It is accumulated, one small private act at a time, in the fields and the roads and the kitchen thresholds of an ordinary life, visible to anyone patient enough to look. If this story stays with you, carry that forward. You are being seen by someone, somewhere, in the small, unremarkable moment you think is private. Be the person who stops for the turtle. May God bless you and protect your family. And may you find, wherever the road has taken you, that there is still a piece of ground in this world waiting to be home.